What if I told you that everything you think you know about ancient Egypt is a shadow of a memory? A magnificent, global civilization reduced to sun-drenched sand, golden masks, and dusty tombs. We've been handed a postcard, a beautiful, convenient lie, while the true library of their genius was burned, scattered, and actively forgotten. But what if the greatest secret of Kemet, their true source of power, was never in the pyramids or the pharaohs, but hidden deep within their lost universities, the spiritual and scientific powerhouses they built? Hold on to that thought, because the real history begins not with the glory, but with the sudden, terrifying silence. Picture this: the world's first and most profound intellectual tradition, a system of knowledge called the mysteries of Kemet, vanishes. Gone. Not just a memory faded by time, but a deliberate erasure so comprehensive, so brutal, that it leaves an intellectual void still haunting us 3,000 years later. Why? What knowledge was so dangerous, so powerful, that its very existence had to be purged from the historical record? For too long, Kemet, or Egypt as we call it, has been portrayed as an anomaly, a fluke of brilliance born on the Nile, disconnected from the dark, expansive continent it belongs to. But this isolation narrative is the first lie we have to tear down. Because the spirituality, the architecture, the cosmology, the very soul of Kemet is undeniably African, rooted in the civilizations of the South, in the land of Nubia and beyond, a heritage history has desperately tried to scrub clean. But the real mystery isn't where Kemet came from, it's where its most advanced knowledge went. We talk about the libraries of Alexandria, but those came late. The true knowledge was taught in the secretive, specialized per-ankh, the houses of life. These weren't mere schools. They were philosophical arsenals, institutions of advanced science, astronomy, and transcendent metaphysics, operating for thousands of years. Think of a place where priests were physicists, where scribes mapped the stars, and where the concept of the soul was a matter of rigorous scientific study. That was the house of life. Imagine the greatest minds of the ancient world walking those halls. The Greeks, Pythagoras, Solon, Plato, Thales, they didn't just visit Kemet, they became students. They sat at the feet of the black African priests and initiates, and they returned home with the seeds of what we now call Western philosophy. But here's the crucial detail: they weren't given the complete curriculum. They received fragments, distillations, the exoteric knowledge, the truly transformative, internal, spiritual technology of the mysteries, the knowledge that allowed Kemet to endure for millennia, that was kept sacred and secret. It was the core curriculum of the Lost Schools. And now, for the first major turn in our story, the knowledge wasn't lost to forgetfulness. It was lost to war and ideological conquest. When the empires of the north, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans, began to carve up Kemet, they understood a fundamental truth. To truly conquer a people, you must conquer their memory and their intellectual foundation. They could destroy the temples, but the per-ankh held the living heart of Kemet. The destruction was systematic. Libraries were targeted. Priests were silenced, often violently. And the most sensitive scrolls, the ones detailing the highest levels of the spiritual science, were not destroyed. They were hidden, sent deep down the Nile, back into the ancestral lands of the South, or smuggled out by desperate initiates who watched their world burn. The fear was simple. If this knowledge, which posited a black African spiritual origin for the world's wisdom, fell into the hands of the invaders, it would be corrupted, twisted, or weaponized against its originators. This is the point where our conventional narrative fails. Historians show us the slow decline of the empire, but they skip the intellectual and spiritual catastrophe. The power of Kemet wasn't in its armies. It was in the continuous, unbroken transmission of knowledge through these schools. When the invaders severed that link, they didn't just end an empire, they broke the world's most ancient educational lineage. It was an intellectual genocide. But what if a few of those hidden scrolls survived? What if the most powerful secrets of Kemet, the blueprint for creating a society that valued wisdom over wealth and spirituality over conquest, are still out there, waiting in the shadows? Consider the legendary papyrus of the Black Gods, rumored to contain the full account of the Kemetic creation story, the Pesachit, linking their earliest deities directly to the civilizations of the Great Lakes region in Africa. Imagine the chaos that single document would cause, shattering the Eurocentric view of history that dominates our textbooks. The question then becomes, who were the guardians of the deepest secrets? Couldn't have been the priests who remained in the compromised temples. It had to be the initiates, the ones who had mastered the knowledge of the stars, the power of sound, and the internal alchemy of the soul. They became the diaspora of wisdom. They carried the spiritual core of Kemet on their backs, moving south, moving west, silently influencing the emergent civilizations of Africa and even Europe, all while the world forgot their source. We are left with a ghost story, the grand, imposing architecture of Kemet standing as a monument to what was lost. But the true artifact is the missing knowledge itself, the powerful, African wisdom that shaped the ancient world and was then systematically removed from its own historical context. We need to stop asking what the Egyptians built and start asking what they knew and why that knowledge had to disappear. The answer, I promise you, is a threat to the current world order. A threat buried in the sand, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed. The search for the lost schools begins now. And our first lead takes us not to the familiar pyramids, but to the forgotten Black Kingdom that was Kemet's equal, its rival, and ultimately, its final safe harbor, the Kingdom of Kush. The Nile, the lifeblood of Kemet, flows south, tracing a path back to the deepest roots of African civilization. But conventional history tells us the story ends at Aswan, the traditional boundary. The truth is, the story of the lost knowledge only begins there, in a place we barely recognize, a civilization both fiercely independent and profoundly linked to Kemet, the Kingdom of Kush. This wasn't just a neighbor, it was a twin soul, often a conqueror, and ultimately, the silent guardian of the Kemetic secret. After the intellectual purge, when the scrolls were hidden and the priests scattered, the surviving knowledge migrated upriver, not into the arms of a foreign power, but into a stable, Black African kingdom that spoke the same spiritual language. This transition point, this intellectual escape route, is the biggest historical blind spot we possess. Kush, with its capital Meroe, became the new Per-Ankh, a vast, covert university that historians have largely ignored, focusing instead on their military conflicts with Egypt. But look closely at the evidence, and the narrative changes entirely. The pyramid fields of Meroe are arguably more numerous than those of Giza, though they are smaller and steeper. Why this sudden, sustained burst of pyramid building? It wasn't simple imitation. It was a defiant declaration that the architectural, religious, and cosmological traditions of the Nile Valley, the very essence of Kemet, had been transferred and preserved here, safe from the cultural pollution of the north. Kush was continuing the work. The priests of Kemet, the masters of the esoteric knowledge, didn't vanish into the desert. They were absorbed into the courts and temples of Kush. They carried with them the crucial, unpublished texts on the nature of Ka, vital essence, and Ba, soul personality, the advanced mathematics used to orient the temples, and the astronomical tables for predicting celestial events. Imagine a secret society fleeing a crumbling state, bringing with them the most valuable cultural assets of their entire civilization. This is where the story deepens into true historical mythology. We are searching for the lost schools of Kemet, but perhaps the schools were not lost. Perhaps they were simply relocated. Meroe, in its prime, was a hub of iron smelting, advanced pottery, and a written language, Meroitic, that still resists full decipherment. Why the resistance? Is it possible that the untranslated texts contain the unedited, dangerous truth about Kemetic African origins? The possibility is immense and terrifying to mainstream historians. Consider the role of the Candaces of Meroe, powerful, reigning queens who led armies and ruled with unparalleled spiritual authority. This matrilineal power structure is a hallmark of many deep African traditions, a contrast to the later patriarchal systems that overran Egypt. The presence of the Candaces strongly suggests that the Kemetic wisdom that survived was filtered through a distinctly southern, African spiritual lens, empowering women in ways the invading cultures simply could not tolerate. It was a complete philosophical system resistant to foreign dogma. There are rumors, whispers in historical circles, of a secret subterranean library beneath the sands near Meroe, known only as the Archive of the South. This is the ultimate prize. the collection of scrolls smuggled from Thebes and Memphis, containing the complete teachings of the houses of life, untouched by Roman fire or Greek reinterpretation. These aren't just historical documents. They are a working manual for an advanced civilization. They contain the knowledge of sacred geometry, of medicinal botany, and the precise techniques for achieving higher states of consciousness, the Hunu that the Kemetic initiates pursued. The tension lies in the nature of this knowledge. The Greeks took the geometry and the astronomy, but they missed the underlying metaphysics, the belief that the universe operates on the principle of Ma'at, balance, and cosmic order. The Lost Schools taught that true power came not from domination, but from alignment with Ma'at. That is the revolutionary, world-changing concept that the invaders desperately wanted to erase. They wanted power through control. Kemet offered power through understanding. The silence around Kush is not accidental. By minimizing the intellectual achievements of the Black African kingdom to the south, the dominant historical narrative effectively creates a firewall, preventing us from tracing the Kemetic wisdom back to its true, continuous African source. It allows them to maintain the convenient fantasy of an isolated, whitewashed Egypt. But the presence of Kemetic gods like Ammonius and Mut, celebrated and enshrined in the temples of Kush, shows the spiritual flame was not extinguished. It was relocated and protected. We are hunting a shadow, a whisper of an intellectual empire that vanished. But if the archive of the South exists, then the Lost Schools never truly died. They simply went underground, teaching in code, weaving their wisdom into the mythology and oral traditions of the subsequent African kingdoms that rose after Kush. They became the secret societies and mystical brotherhoods whose origins remain obscure to this day. The search for a hidden archive of unparalleled wisdom continues. But our next step must be to understand the precise content of the scrolls that were so feared. What did they actually teach about humanity's past? And why did that teaching pose such an existential threat to the powers that sought to conquer Kemet? The answer is buried in the myth of the first time, the Zep Tepi, a concept that utterly redefines human history. The greatest secret held within the Lost Schools of Kemet was not architectural or military, it was philosophical. It concerned the true age of humanity and the profound, transformative power of the human mind. To truly understand the knowledge that was censored, we must dive into the concept the Kemetic priests called Zep Tepi the first time. It is more than a creation myth. It is an historical and cosmological marker that utterly destroys the conventional timeline of civilization. Historians tell us Kemet rose around 3100 BCE, emerging mysteriously from the desert sands. But the priests of the houses of life, the keepers of the profound tradition, insisted that their lineage stretched back much further, into an epoch of global brilliance, a golden age that existed long before the dynasties we study. The Zep Tepi describes a time when the world was ruled by divine beings or highly advanced priest-kings who transmitted pure, perfect knowledge to humanity. This wasn't primitive spirituality, it was advanced spiritual science. Why is this so threatening? Because the scrolls detailing the Zep Tepi contained more than stories. They contained the techniques, the very methodologies used by these first people. They spoke of a system of sacred geometry that could harmonize human consciousness with cosmic rhythms, and an understanding of acoustic physics that allowed them to manipulate stone and sound. We see the echoes of this knowledge in the perfectly aligned pyramids and temples, structures built with a precision that still baffles modern engineers. They are relics of the Zep Tepi science. The core curriculum of the Lost Schools was dedicated to recreating the wisdom of this first time. The initiates spent decades mastering the arts of meditation, contemplation, and initiation, a process designed to unlock the dormant, higher faculties of the mind. This was the true mystery school. The goal was the realization of one's own divinity, the understanding that the individual was a microcosm of the macrocosm. This practice, known as the Mysteries of Osiris, was the spiritual technology that gave Kemet its stability and endurance. The scrolls that were targeted for destruction were the ones detailing the highest stages of this initiation. The invading powers didn't fear the Kemetic gods. They feared the Kemetic methodology for creating self-aware, spiritually sovereign human beings. A population that understood the physics of consciousness and their connection to the infinite is impossible to enslave or control. The goal of the intellectual purge was to replace spiritual sovereignty with political submission. This is where the story of the Lost Schools converges with the historical mythology of the world. The surviving initiates carrying these fragmented teachings traveled. As they spread, their wisdom became the underground source for countless later traditions. The Hermetic philosophy, the foundation of alchemy, the mystical branches of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the various secret societies that emerged in Europe. All these traditions acknowledge a profound African source of wisdom, often traced vaguely back to Egypt or Hermes Trismegistus, the Greek name for the Kemetic god of knowledge, Thoth. But the crucial element that was lost in translation and adaptation was the African context. The understanding that this profound spiritual science was inextricably linked to the land, the people, and the cosmology of the Nile Valley. When the invaders stripped the science of its geography, they robbed it of its identity, making it easy to appropriate and ultimately to claim as their own invention centuries later. This intellectual theft is the largest crime in history. Imagine the complete, unedited scrolls now. Not just Plato's filtered accounts, but the full textbooks on Kemetic psychology, texts that describe the 9 distinct parts of the soul, Ba, Ka, Ak, Shut, Ren, etc., and provided the specific internal techniques to unify them. This was the science of the soul, the most advanced knowledge of the Per-Ankh. It detailed how to transcend the physical limitations and access higher dimensions of reality. That is the true power that was deemed too dangerous to exist. The final piece of this historical puzzle is the realization that the Lost Schools of Kemet are not entirely gone. They exist in the fragments, the proverbs, the symbolism, the surviving temple carvings, and most importantly, the oral traditions of the African continent that have preserved the spiritual truths independent of the written word. These oral archives, passed down through generations of healers, storytellers, and spiritual leaders in West and Central Africa, often contain concepts and cosmological names that perfectly mirror those found in the earliest Kemetic texts. This is the ultimate proof of the intellectual diaspora. The next step is to find where these scattered fragments of wisdom coalesce. If the scrolls survived in the hidden libraries of Kush, and the oral traditions preserved the philosophy across the continent, then there must be a point, a nexus, where the two streams meet. A place where the written text and the spoken word confirm the truth of the Zep Tepi and the profound, transformative science of the soul. Our search for the missing pieces now leads us from the silent pyramids of Kush, across the vast Sahara, to the vibrant, surviving mystical traditions of West Africa, where a final, shocking reveal awaits concerning the ultimate fate of the chief initiates. We have tracked the Lost Schools of Kemet from the great houses of life, through the purging fire of conquest, and into the protected sanctuaries of Kush. We've established that the deepest secret was the science of the soul, the profound metaphysics of Zep Tepi, and the ultimate goal was spiritual sovereignty. Now, we must ask the final, pivotal question. If the written schools were destroyed and the scrolls hidden, how does the knowledge survive today? The answer lies in the greatest enduring legacy of Kemet, the African secret societies. When the last great initiates fled Kush, carrying the core spiritual technology of the mysteries, they didn't found new empires. They founded invisible colleges. These were not physical buildings, but interconnected, highly secretive networks that moved with the flow of migrating peoples and trade routes, embedding their profound wisdom into the cultural DNA of West and Central Africa. The greatest example of this transference is seen in the foundational myths and practices of groups like the Dogon of Mali. For decades, scholars dismissed the Dogon as an isolated, primitive tribe. Then came the revelation. Their cosmological knowledge perfectly mirrored the most esoteric astronomical knowledge of Kemet, specifically concerning the star system Sirius, or Sopdet as the Kemetics called it. The Dogon possessed an intimate, detailed understanding of Sirius B, an invisible dwarf star that orbits the visible Sirius A, a star unseen by the naked eye and only officially discovered by Western science in the mid-20th century. How is this possible? The prevailing theory is that the Per-Ankh initiates, the final generation of the Lost Schools, settled among the Dogon. They translated the complex astronomical data of the Kemetic priesthood, the very knowledge that allowed Kemet to calibrate its temples and predict the flooding of the Nile, into the local oral traditions and ritual practices. The knowledge wasn't written down in scrolls that could be burned. It was inscribed into the living culture, the ultimate unburnable archive. This realization redefines our historical perspective. The lost schools of Kemet did not cease to exist. They became the philosophical bedrock of subsequent African civilizations. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic balance and truth, can be traced directly into the ethical systems of the Ashanti and Yoruba. The 9-part soul system of Kemet finds direct parallels in the spiritual anatomy taught in the initiation rites of the Poro societies. The final, emotionally gripping revelation of this story is the truth about the chief initiates themselves. They did not simply become teachers, they became the very mythology. The concept of the Namo in Dogon tradition, the mythical amphibious beings who brought knowledge and civilization, is strikingly similar to the Neteru divine principles of Kemet, particularly the early gods of water and creation. The Dogon described the Namo arriving in a granary or vessel, a coded memory, perhaps, of the final initiates arriving from the Nile Valley by boat, carrying the seeds of the lost schools. The payoff for the viewer is this. The effort to erase the intellectual legacy of Kemet as an African civilization was comprehensive, but ultimately failed. The invaders took the gold and the monuments, but the true wealth, the advanced spiritual and scientific knowledge, was entrusted to the indigenous cultures of Africa, where it has remained preserved and protected, often hidden in plain sight within the layers of ritual and oral tradition. Today, the quest to reclaim this lost knowledge is not just academic. It is an act of historical justice. It means understanding that the fundamentals of Western mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy have their deepest roots not in the Mediterranean, but in the Black African genius of the Nile Valley. The lost schools of Kemet are not buried under the sand. They live in the rhythms, the rituals, and the deep, abiding wisdom of the African continent. They were transformed from institutions of stone into institutions of the spirit. The silence around them was a clever disguise, a necessary tactic of survival. And now, the true history, the one that reconnects the ancient world to its African heart, is finally ready to be told. The grand, unedited curriculum of the Per-Ankh is waiting to be deciphered, not in a museum, but in the living, breathing cultures that still hold its code. This is the knowledge that changes everything.